Hello, Brubs. We're back with Herzl as I remember him. Herzl, of course, was the founder of Zionism and the movement to found Israel. This is by Erwin Rosenberger, and I believe it's from 1957, 59. I was wrong, bruv. There's Herzl right there. Let's get into it. We're about getting roughly halfway through. Pretty easy reading book. Gives you the basics of who Herzl was, the inner workings of Herzl, and all that sort of thing. Herzl came straight from the railroad station to the print shop, bringing a sheaf of manuscripts with him. He was the same genial Herzl as always, but there was something new in his face and hearing and bearing. Let me turn down this fan. It's rather loud. It's not that hot tonight. Oh. There. I put it on the porch, bro. But there was something new in his face and bearing. He was now a victor returning home, and yet one whom victory had not made haughty. I could still hear the words as he spoke them. We had a great success. He said it earnestly, simply, but with a lighting of the eyes. We meant all those who had come to contribute their efforts at the Basel Congress and all the others who had been there in spirit. Herzl offered no details for the time being, and I did not ask questions, for we had a great deal of work ahead of us. For some unaccountable reason, one trifling incident of this first day of Herzl's return has remained in my memory. Perhaps it is worth a moment's digression. Soon after our first exchange of greetings, Herzl said to me in a matter of fact way, "Rosenberger, I would like your opinion." Then he turned his neck to me and asked, "Can I still wear this collar?" He always wore a stiff white collar, which was separately buttoned onto his shirt. His fondness for it, in fact, had led us to dub it the Herzl collar. He was in no sense a dandy, but he liked to be well dressed. Now he wanted to know whether, after the vicissitudes of a long journey, his collar was still presentable. I carefully studied the object in question and then delivered my judgment. "Oh yes, it still looks fine." After I had informed Herzl how things were progressing with the Congress issue of Die Welt, we took an exploratory walk through the shop. Then, taking a pile of unedited manuscripts from the desk, he said, "Let's go over to the cafe." Across the street was a small suburban-type cafe. We now hied ourselves to it. I'm not sure if that's a word, but there we go. Laden down with manuscripts and galley proofs, we ordered coffee and rolls with Herzl standing treat and went busily to work. Our activity stirred no particular interest among the other guests or the waiter. What do you got, bruv? It was nothing uncommon for the marble-topped tables of Viennese coffee houses to be converted into temporary writing desks. From time to time, Herzl made a clarifying remark about something that had happened at Basel. Whenever a manuscript was ready for setting or a proof had been revised, I took it over to the print shop. 2 days before, acclaimed as a veritable Messiah, Herzl had been pronouncing the closing words before an historic assemblage. Now he was sitting in an unpretentious little cafe, diligently and indeed enthusiastically plying his journalistic trade. The next day, the readers of Die Welt would have an authentic first-hand report on the first Zionist Congress. You see, he said to me, Die Welt is once again proving its worth as an organ that makes us independent of other papers, which either ignore the Congress altogether or report only what and as much as they please of what happened. At noon, Herzl interrupted our editorial work and invited me to have lunch with him. A 5-minute walk took us to Das Auge, Gottes, a popular restaurant on the Nussdorfer Hauptstrasse, where we sat down at an open-air table. While we ate, and afterward, Herzl told me again how pleased he was with the course of the Congress and with the promising outlook for the future. In doing so, he made one statement which particularly impressed me and which I often recalled in later years. He reflected silently a few seconds, then looked at me fixedly and said, in a lowered voice, as though anxious not to be overheard, "Don't repeat this to anyone, for they would ridicule you, but it is true none the less. At Basel, we laid the foundation for our Jewish state. Of all those who were striving for the realization of the Zionist idea, it was Herzl who believed most firmly that the goal was attainable and would one day be attained. This faith was what gave him his astonishing strength and, at the same time, strengthened and spurred on his followers. On the way back to the cafe, Herzl mentioned with particular appreciation and admiration the inestimable contribution which Max Nordau had made, by word and deed, to the success of the Congress. A great deal of work still remained on the issue, and the printing presses were standing ready for the order to roll. We will provide the gist of what happened at the Congress, Herzl said. Later on, the complete official record will appear separately. Our task was to pack all the most important material into Die Welt's 18 pages of text. We shortened, condensed, omitted, and tried as much as possible to leave the crucial, informative parts intact. The petty mutinies which a handful of rebels had staged in the Congress Hall amid nearly unanimous disapproval were given no more space than they deserved. Shortly before we finished our editorial chores at the cafe, a difference of opinion developed between Herzl and me. The point at issue was a short address which Professor Max Mandelstam of Kiev had delivered toward the end of the Congress. After appealing to Herzl to preserve and not yield to discouragement, he had expressed thanks in the name of the Congress to those who had helped make it a success. But above all and first of all, we thank the courageous man to whom we are chiefly indebted for the fact that we have gathered here from every country to provide for the future of our people. I refer to the distinguished president of the Congress, Dr. Theodor Herzl. The assembly rises from its seats and breaks into loud cheering. I believe I am speaking for all members of the Congress when I fervently entreat him, not to be deterred by the arduous labor he has already done and still has to do, or by the obstacles and annoyances that have beset him and will yet beset him, from with the same quality of intellect and the same self-sacrifice, the difficult but rewarding work that he has begun. Long live Dr. Theodor Herzl. The assembly joins enthusiastically in this cry. When I read Professor Mandelstram's concluding words, I laid down my pen and leaned back, shaking my head. "What's the matter?" Herzl asked. That passage doesn't sound well at all, I replied. Which passage? I read it aloud slowly, annoyances that have beset him and will yet beset him. What is your objection to that? It's a Cassandra cry, I explained. He prophesies unpleasant things. Why paint things black? I am prepared for whatever may come, said Herzl. Professor Mandelstam is an excellent doctor, but not even his prognoses are infallible, I objected. Predictions of that sort tend to dishearten, to discourage. Discouraged? Asked Herzl. Discourage whom? Some of Die Welt's readers. The evasiveness of my answer was probably noticeable. I see, said Herzl teasingly, that you are superstitious and believe in omens. The discussion continued a while longer until finally Herzl said, I think you attribute too much importance to those few words, but, and he shrugged slightly, you do as you see fit. The complete text will appear in the official record anyway. And so I proceeded to strike the future annoyances from the manuscript. I wish I had the same power to strike them from Herzl's life. The following day, September 3rd, with Die Welt's Congress issue printed and ready for mailing, Herzl informed me that he was leaving for Ischl to spend a little while with his family and gave them a personal account of the events at Basel. 25. Herzl never tried to conceal the fact that before any particularly important or difficult undertaking, he was in the habit of asking his parents' blessing. From certain indications, I concluded that he had done so before leaving for the Zionist Congress in Basel. Now that he was going to Ischl, I strongly suspected that one of his purposes was to thank his mother and father for a blessing which, he felt, had contributed to the favorable outcome of the Congress. On the surface, Herzl's view of the world seemed to be a pantheistic one, yet his desire to receive a parental blessing showed that somewhere deep within him he believed in the personal God of Jewish monotheism. Herzl always deleted atheistic remarks from Welt articles, lest they offend some readers' religious feelings. His innate tact was reinforced by many years' experience on newspapers, which made it a policy to exclude anti-religious allusions from their columns. The readers of Die Welt, who included a good many Orthodox Jews, had to be treated with particular discretion. But Herzl's distaste for atheistic utterances unquestionably sprang from another source as well, one to which the paragraphs above should offer a clue. Like many a Jew without strong religious feelings, in whom nevertheless a consciousness of the God of my fathers still stirs, he may well have said to himself, I will not permit defamation of that which generations upon generations of my fathers and mothers have loved and venerated. During Herzl's brief stay in Ischl, the postman delivered an item to our office, which, upon inspection, I quickly bid from unauthorized eyes. It was an ordinary postcard, postmarked Vienna, and written in an unmistakably feminine hand. It was addressed to the Honorable Dr. Theodor Herzl. The text side contained neither date nor signature, only the following two stanzas of a poem. Bitte. I don't know German, so I'll just wait till we get the translation. Here it is. Entreaty, rest upon me, thou dark eye. Wield all thy might, earnest, gentle, dreamy, fathomlessly sweet night. Take with thy magic darkness this world away from me, that lonely above my life thou mayst eternally hovering be. It took no great acumen to perceive that a fair admirer of Herzl had chosen this means of declaring her secret passion. The verse I recalled from my not too distant gymnasium days, was by the Austrian poet Nicholas Linal. Lest the card provide merriment for some irreverent soul, I locked it in my desk drawer. When Herzl visited the Welt office 2 days later, I gave him some letters which had arrived during his absence, together with the postcard. He had just sat down at his desk, and there was no one else in the room. Leafing through the mail, he finally arrived at the lyrical missive. He read it with a grave expression, and I noticed a slight flush spreading over his face. Then he read it a second time. I suspected it that he was trying to decide just how he should behave. That's he finally observed in an indifferent tone, leaving the word hanging in air. Yes, Lanao, I replied with equal nonchalance. Someone is having a joke. Someone with lots of time on his hands. He made a motion as though to tear up the joke, then changed his mind, crumpled the card up, and put it in his pocket. Our conversation whereupon turned to editorial matters pertaining to Die Welt. Die Welt. 26. The lead articles which Herzl wrote for Die Welt were true labors of love. In Die Welt he could say whatever he pleased, could give free rein to his thoughts and emotions without worrying about what his editor-in-chief might think. For there he was, the editor-in-chief, and the supreme judge of everything that flowed from his pen. Herzl wrote a great many of his Welt articles under the pseudonym Benjamin Cerf. That was, in fact, his Hebrew name. It was also a real nom de guerre, with which he signed his most militant articles. One of these, which appeared in the issue of October 15, 1897, created something of a sensation that extended even beyond Die Welt's regular readership. It was entitled Marshal, a name often applied in Germany and Australia to a vulgar type of Jew. Marshal was a fighting article which gave no quarter. In it, Herzl divided the Jews into two groups, the decent ones and the opposite kind, the Marshal ilk. In addition to other evil qualities and impulses, Marshal cherished and expressed in most treacherous fashion a profound aversion for the Jewish state idea. Marshal is an anti-Zionist. Marshal is an anti-Zionist was the way Herzl's article began, and it closed with a warning that Marshal would one day get his just deserts. The connoisseur can distinguish a fine wine under whichever label it may appear. Among the readers of Die Welt were the two publishers and editors-in-chief of the new Free Press, Maurice Benedict and Dr. Bacher, who could recognize a Herzl article regardless of pseudonym. Several days after the appearance of Marshal, Herzl told me, Benedict said to him with a significant smile, "You should get the author of Marshal to write for the new Free Press." One day in October 1897, Herzl said to me, "Rosenberger, you must help me." "Gladly," I replied. "Here is the problem. Fewell wants to have a humorous wedding newspaper printed for his sister's marriage. He has asked me for a contribution, some verse or something of the sort. I'm not in the mood right now, though. It would mean shifting to a new key. Will you do me a favor and compose something? I'll submit it to the wedding newspaper under my name." I promised to oblige as quickly as possible. The matter of authorship didn't bother me, since it was a question of helping Herzl out of a mild predicament. Busy as he was, if he wanted to put his signature to the bit of doggerel in order to be spared the necessity of shifting to a new key, then I had no objection to the innocent deception. He who makes a tryst with the muse, however, cannot always set its duration in advance. The couple of lines I had intended to write turned into 6 verses of 6 lines each, written in an iambic pentameter whose solemnity rivaled that of an ancient Greek chorus. The wedding newspaper appeared, together with my contribution, but what were my astonishment and delight at finding that Herzl had provided the following foreword. Dear editor, in accordance with your kind invitation, I wanted to compose, or at least try to compose, a contribution for the wedding newspaper, Our World, since you were harrying me to death and demanding that I produce a poem instanter, whereas it often takes me a year to find a rhyme for a word. I asked my friend Erwin Rosenberger to compose something for me. I wanted to pass it off then as my work. However, Rosenberger played the dastardly trick of writing such a beautiful poem that no one would ever believe it was mine. There is thus nothing left for me but to confess my attempted fraud. The intended wrong has, in any case, been righted. Our world is not, let us hope, one in which one becomes bored. With wedding greetings and heartiest congratulations, yours faithfully, Theodore Herzl, sister and brother by the falsifier, Erwin Rosenberger. Then followed my 6 verses. I was particularly amused by Herzl's description of me under the title, with its humorous distortion of the facts. He had masterminded the whole plot, and here he was publicly branding me innocent, obedient lamb that I was a falsifier. Apropos of this episode, I recall an earlier occasion on which Herzl and I discussed which was more difficult to write, a poem or an article. I had remarked that it was easier to produce a poem, but Herzl disagreed. I have always felt, he said, that putting together verses is the most difficult of the two. Herzl was never a teller of jokes. Unlike many others, he was not given to retailing the latest funny story that was making the rounds. Nor, for that matter, did he need to. When the occasion called for it, he could always produce a bit of authentic Herzlian wit that easily held its own with the current quips. In his speeches, on the other hand, he had no objection to using anecdotes to support his rhetorical points. One of the few occasions on which I recall Herzl repeating someone else's bon mot in private conversation was just after the first Zionist Congress. When he returned to Vienna from Basel, he greeted me with a pun coined by one of the delegates. Basiltov, Basel, the German name for Basil, lent itself readily to a play on the popular Jewish expression of congratulations, Mazel Tov. Is it Basiltov then? Though he often dictated letters, I do not recall ever having seen Herzl dictate one of his feuilletons or other literary or journalistic creations. When he wrote, he preferred to sit pen in hand alone with his thoughts. He was more the contemplative than the declamatory type, and the presence of another person would have interfered with the creative process. It is true that in the early Welt days I often sat near him in his study while he worked on an article. However, I was a companion who did not disturb, who sat there to all appearances, oblivious of everything about me but the manuscripts and proof sheets that covered my desk. 27. In the first week of December 1897, Herzl's wife said to me, Herr Rosenberger, I have a request to make of you, an important request, but it must remain a secret. My husband must know nothing about it, you understand? The last 2 words were addressed to the Herzl children's governess, who nodded assent. It is to be a surprise for Hanukkah, which we are celebrating in the last week of December. Frau Herzl continued in her calm, pleasant manner. Heretofore, she explained, the Herzl family had gathered around a gaily decorated Christmas tree on Christmas Eve so that the children could have the same pleasure as the Gentile children in the neighborhood. From now on, however, her husband wanted things to be different. The Jewish festival of Hanukkah was to be celebrated in December instead of Christmas, and the menorah, the seven-armed candelabrum, was to be lighted instead of the candles on the Christmas tree. Frau Herzl showed that she was well informed about the meaning of the 8-day Hanukkah festival, about its connection with the priestly family of the Maccabees, who had led a heroic struggle against foreign rule in ancient Judea. I also had the impression that one of her main reasons for introducing this historical background into the conversation was to make clear to the Gentile governess why the Christmas tree was being abandoned. As for the important request, Frau Herzl wanted me to write a simple little poem for her younger daughter, Trude, to recite on the evening of December 19th before the first Hanukkah candle was lighted. It would be a pleasant surprise for the little girl's father. Trude was at that time about 4 years old. Her older sister Pauline was 7. Perhaps, I suggested, Pauline would find it easier to memorize and recite the poem. We will see, said Frau Herzl. Either Trudel or Pauline. In the end, Pauline recited the poem on the first night of Hanukkah. Frau Herzl told me afterward that she had carried out her assignment without stumbling and with correct emphasis, and that Herzl had been very pleased. The incident of the Hanukkah poem proved how ready Frau Herzl was to show sympathy and understanding for the new career to which her husband had dedicated. Subsequently, she often accompanied him to public Maccabean celebrations and gatherings. I noted on all these occasions that she attentively followed the speeches and discussion, particularly, of course, when Herzl himself, mounted the speaker's platform. Frau Herzl was pleased and proud at the mighty ovations accorded her husband, but she made no public display of her enthusiasm. I still have a vivid picture of her sitting at Herzl's right among the guests of honor at a Maccabean celebration, simply dressed and charming. All who saw her spoke to her with her unassuming, winning manner. Herzl could always appear publicly with his wife, secure in the knowledge that she would look and act in a way that did him credit. From Herzl was also for Frau Herzl was also a reader of Die Welt. From various remarks I heard her make, moreover, it was apparent that she read it with sound judgment. She did not have the slightest trace of arrogance or conceit. When she spoke, it was with an unpretentious sincerity of manner. I recall, too, how much common sense and other psychological insight her remarks revealed. One of her most attractive qualities, it always seemed to me, was her calm, even disposition. Everything about her, speech, gestures, manner of walking, and facial expression, suggested a kind of imperturbability. And yet, while placid, she could in no sense be described as a phlegmatic person. It cannot have been easy for Herzl's wife to take a sympathetic attitude toward the Zionist movement. Indeed, that sympathy implied a substantial measure of self-denial. For what Herzl gave in time and devotion to his yearned to his yearned for what Herzl gave in time and devotion of his to his yearned for yearned. Why would I say yearned? For his yearned for Jewish state, he inevitably took from his family life, his wife and children. His passionate absorption in a political cause could not but distract, and sometimes even blot out his thoughts of his loved ones. For Frau Julie Herzl, Zionism represented a rival, and it was only her love for her husband that made it possible for her to summon love and understanding for that rival. 28. for several days in January 1898. An atmosphere of crisis reigned at Die Welt. Herzl had resolved to fight a duel. It all came about in the following manner. There was living at that time an Austrian archaeologist and explorer, Dr. Eduard Glaser, who had achieved renown for his studies in Arabia. In Munich, where he was resting after his latest expedition, word reached Dr. Glaser that the Viennese journalist Theodor Herzl had organized a movement to found a Jewish state in Palestine. The news interested him, for Palestine came, in a general sense, within his own professional purview. Back in 1890, in fact, Glaser had himself proposed the creation of a Jewish state, but in southern Arabia rather than Palestine. This project had come to Herzl's attention in the summer of 1896, several months before the appearance of his Judenstaat. The idea of transplanting the Jews to southern Arabia was not to his taste, but he felt that the author of the plan might one day prove a worthwhile collaborator. This Glaser, he wrote in his diary on August 3rd, 1896, is a man who should be kept in mind. In any event, he has considerable knowledge of the East, and he may even have a talent for military organization. Before very long, Glaser was to provide more than ample reason for being kept in mind. Toward the end of 1897, as he pondered Herzl's Jewish state idea in his Munich retreat, a fantastic thought occurred to Dr. Glaser. Herzl, he decided, was an ally of England, and it was for her benefit that he wanted to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. Herzl's creation was to serve as a buffer state. Whenever England, whose sphere of influence extended beyond the Suez Canal to the southern border of Palestine, this goes on, doesn't it? Was threatened from the north by Tsarist Russia, perhaps the Jewish state would absorb the first shock of the blow, or even altogether prevent a collision of the two hostile powers. Not only that, it would also help promote the disintegration of Turkey and, still acting in England's interest, protect the land and still acting in England's interest, protect the land route from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean to India. As the end product of his weighty ruminations, Glaser concluded that Herzl's Jewish state plan was anti-Turkish, anti-Russian, and anti-French, that it would cause a reopening of the so-called Eastern Question, and that it therefore constituted a threat to world peace. He ain't wrong. The noted archaeologist thereupon embodied all these ideas in an article which he sent to the widely read democratic newspaper, the Berliner Tagblatt. The Tagblatt, whose editor-in-chief, Arthur Leveson, was a friend of Herzl's but an anti-Zionist, published it on December 26, 1897, under the title Zionism, a Reopening of the Eastern Question. In his article, Glaser informed Herzl's followers that they were visionaries, dreamers, and fanatics who were intoxicated with Zion. As for their leader, he strongly implied that Herzl was actually conspiring with England. Stripped of all circumlocutions, the article accused Herzl of being a British agent who was luring the Jewish people into a nefarious adventure designed to serve the strategic interests of his employers in London. That Glaser was fully aware of the gravity of his charge seems almost doubtful, and yet any accusation, however absurd and far-fetched, will find some willing listeners unless it is promptly answered. Indeed, voices were already being raised here and there on the strength of Glaser's article. The Zionist movement, as well as Herzl's personal honor, was in danger of being gravely compromised. A decisive rebuttal was needed. On January 4th, 1898, the Berliner Tagblatt published a reply by Herzl, reprinted in Die Welt on January 14th, which thoroughly laid bare the fallacy of Glazer's reasoning. The old warrior Max Nordau also entered the lists with a plain spoken article in the Tagelblatt describing Glazer's contentious as Arabian fairy tales, which merited only a smile. Nordau added, however, he has made insinuations to which we must at once take vigorous exception. He depicts us as puppets dangling from wires pulled in England. He also intimates that this may not even be an unconscious process, but rather that we are acting deliberately in accordance with secret agreements, that we are intentionally and calculatedly misleading the Jews who trust and follow us in order to make them the tools and very shortly the victims of selfish English schemes. Why we should engage in such diabolical machinations, Herr Dr. Glaser very prudently does not say. The only possible reason is sufficiently obvious so that even the most myopic reader can safely be left to discover it for himself. We must be in the pay of the British in selling our Jewish brethren for gold, unless we are fools who don't know what they are doing. Glaser appears to have been unpleasantly surprised by the Herzl and Nordau articles, though he could hardly have expected his charges to go unanswered. He was particularly displeased, however, by a lead article which appeared in Die Welt's first issue for the year 1898. Entitled Settling Accounts, it dealt ruthlessly with Glazer's assertions. The author was given only as spectator. Who was spectator? The question was debated back and forth, since he was clearly a man who knew something about writing and was well informed into the bargain. Glaser suspected first Herzl, then Nordau of hiding behind the pseudonym. Glaser's articles had by now ceased to appear in the Berliner Tagblatt, where he had evidently worn out his welcome. He was therefore compelled to carry on the polemic under less imposing auspices in a Viennese Jewish paper known as Dr. Bloch's Österreichische Wochenschrift. The Wochenschrift's publisher, Dr. Bloch, was clearly as anxious as Glaser to unmask the mysterious spectator, who remained the focus of much of the controversy. But Die Welt offered the following highly uninformative statement. They, Doctors Glaser and Bloch, are tormented by a positively sinful curiosity to know who is lurking behind the pseudonym Spectator. We are accommodating enough to state flatly, that neither Dr. Herzl nor Dr. Nordau has ever written under this pseudonym. Naturally, however, the editors vouch for the contents of the much-quoted article. Herzl continued the counterattack against Glaser in 3 more articles in Die Welt. Then one day, when the battle was at its height, he said to me very calmly, I am thinking of challenging Dr. Glaser. I looked at him, astonished and aghast. He was talking of fighting a duel. Tragic cases in the past flashed through my mind. I thought of Lassalle, Pushkin, Lermontov, all of whom had fallen on the dueling ground, valuable lives stuffed out prematurely. And now Herzl wanted to risk his precious life, which he had dedicated to so lofty a goal, because of a newspaper squabble. I shook my head in vigorous disapproval. You don't like the idea? Herzl asked. Not a bit, I replied bluntly. If one took every newspaper attack seriously, I pointed out, it would mean fighting a duel every week. When one stakes one's very life, it should be for a cause worthy of the sacrifice. In this instance, I saw nothing that could be settled by the shedding of ink. rather than blood that could not be settled. What could the result of a duel possibly prove? And made eloquent by my deep concern, I added that the life that was at stake here belonged not to Herzl alone, but to the Jewish people. Herzl listened with a kind of objective attentiveness, as though he was not personally involved in the affair. I could not tell what impression my arguments were making on him. Finally, he changed the subject of conversation. 2 days later, Dr. Sigmund Werner, who since October 1897 had taken Dr. Landau's place as executive editor of Die Welt, told me that Herzl had advised both him and Schellert, each separately, that he contemplated fighting a duel. Both had been flatly opposed. Werner reported that Herzl had said to him, Rosenberger made the cruelest remark. He said that my challenge would be regarded as a theatrical gesture. That had, in fact, been one of my objections. Nothing further was heard about the duel. Herzl had obviously been convinced by our unanimous opinion that there was no reason for a final arbitrament by pistols or swords. Instead, he terminated the Glazer controversy with a brief note in Die Welt, issue number 8, 1898, which closed with the words, We do not find these disputations and allegations sufficiently interesting to prolong the debate further. And with that, silence descended upon the case of the buffer state and the gentleman who had so rashly brought it into being. But what of the mysterious spectator, whose article had so infuriated Dr. Glaser? The man behind the pseudonym was Dr. Wilhelm Goldbaum, a member of the New Free Press's editorial staff, well versed in world politics and other fields, who sometimes wrote lead articles for Die Welt. And that's going to be it. And we had basically nobody in here tonight, which is great. Who cares? Who cares? You are not needed, brother.